Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, we pride ourselves here on bringing you accurate analysis of history, but Damien Lewis does that, but also pens books that read like thrillers. SAS, The Great Train Raid, is his latest book covering Operation Loco and other epic side missions behind the lines in Italy in 1943 and beyond. So I'm delighted to bring him in now. Good evening, Damien. Another cracking story you've found here. We were just talking about before we get into the story itself, just a lot of this came about just by family members having stuff that you didn't know existed.
Yeah, I mean, without doubt, the most extraordinary episode ever in researching a book and writing a book. So I was 85,000 words into writing this manuscript, having gutted the American archives because it ended up being a joint British-American mission. The Italian archives, believe it or not, they're pretty good, and on World War II, and obviously the British archives. But I was 85,000 words into writing a book, and I just thought, it lacks that kind of real first-person soldier on the ground, I was their account. And I've been contacted by the Hussey family, months ago, saying we've got our grandfather wrote a manuscript about his wartime services in the SAS. Would you be interested in reading it? So I stopped writing at 85,000 words, and I said to them, look, could we meet up and can I have a look at it? And they said, yeah. And they live in Bournemouth, which is not so far away, half an hour's drive. I drove up there, walked into, the household, lemon drizzle cake, coffee, tea, massive pile of archive, big thick manuscript, sat down with Debbie Hussey, the daughter, and said, after, small talk and pleasantry, said, what was the name of your father? I don't even know. And she said it was George Arnold. But don't worry, you'll never have heard of him because no one's ever written anything about him. I don't even know what in this manuscript that we've always had is true or not. And I'm sure you won't be interested. And I kind of paused for a moment in disbelief and said, I'm 85,000 words into writing a book about him and his patrol. And not only that, I said I've got all the archives from America, and the UK, which will prove, the everything in his book, the veracity of. So it was just the most spine-tingling moment. Wow. And for Debbie and her daughter Jo, who first reached out to me, of course, it was really emotional, hugely emotional. And then we had the launch in London like a couple of weeks back at the National Army Museum, and then it was magical, Paul, because Debbie and Jo were there. And so too were the children and grandchildren, massive family of Major Oswald Carey-Elwes, the SS commander who commanded the raid. So not only at the end could I say we have this family, and there are other families there as well, but they all got to meet each other. So for the first time, Debbie Hussey met the family of the man who commanded the mission, which I wrote about it. Those moments they're priceless and special and irreplaceable. And it's because we're losing our World War II veterans every day. It's really now falling to these generations to kind of step up and help tell these stories.
It makes me realize that when you're saying that, is that the SAS and other special forces, after the end of the war, they kind of scatter to the four winds. It's not like a regular kind of county regiment that might have a regular reunion every 6 months or something in Chelmsford or York. These are people who go on to serve their countries or other countries or go to different places. So it seems remarkable that some of these families had this incredible connection but didn't actually meet till 82 years later, whatever it is. But
sure,
anyway, crazy stuff.
Crazy.
So let's talk about, you've been on before, we talked about the SAS moving out of them from out of sort of North Africa into the Mediterranean. And Italy, it's all about Bill Sterling and his vision, isn't it? And his vision of what he wants Second SAS to do is not necessarily quite in line with what the High Command want of SAS, because they've almost been too successful in North Africa and Greece, is that they've now been noticed. And so everybody wants to use them. So going into Italy, what did Bill want to do with the SAS, and what did the people higher up think was a better use of them?
Yeah, I mean, Bill Sterling, David Sterling's brother, of course, who founded two SAS after, at the time of David Sterling's capture, pretty much. So spring 1943. He was an absolute visionary, real kind of gut instinct about guerrilla warfare and special operations deep behind the lines. And his vision for Italy, which was, of course, then in the planning,
Yeah.
for the first Allied attempt to crowbar open fascist and Nazi shores in Europe. And his vision was to drop 300 small patrols, so 2-3-man patrols, deep behind the lines in Italy, to paralyze the communication networks and supply networks. So all the rail networks, all the road networks blown to smithereens. That was his plan. The idea being that would, of course, be a massive support to the Allied landings and help win the war in Italy. And he was absolutely right. He was an absolute visionary. He got just a handful of patrols greenlit and sent in. And some of those did exactly what he wanted, blew up numerous trains, supply trains in tunnels, which is where they targeted them, because you can imagine how hard it is to clear debris in a tunnel. Yeah. It's really difficult. But despite that, despite proving the concept, he was denied. He was denied his mission. And as Bill Sterling said, war's not always about killing people. It's about denying territory to the enemy, and it's about denying supplies and communications to the enemy, crucially. But he wasn't listened to, and so instead the SAS were used, both one SAS and two SAS actually, to form the tip of the spear. So when the Allied troops hit Sicily first and then mainland Italy, they went ashore ahead of all the other troops and basically acted as kind of like pathfinders to find a way through the Italian and German defensives for the rest of the forces to follow.
I mean, Italy seems that we're going down a rabbit hole, but Italy seems to be the place where, in many ways, special forces were misused. I'm thinking about Mark Clark and the First Special Service Force and the Rangers and things like that. It's like it takes to going back into France and Germany for everything to kind of even itself out again, and then being used for their best purpose. The other absolutely. Thing that is sort of a mistake at this point, which is imperative kind of to get across for what we're going to be talking about later, is all the Allied prisoners of war that are being held in Italy, and not just of the countries we think of, not just America and Britain and US, but it's further afield, and there's this idea, this notion of giving out the stay put order, in that everybody should just stay in the camp and we'll come to you when we liberate you. And your book, as other books have kind of revealed that to be basically a very silly idea. We had Sir Nicholas Young on a few weeks ago talking about his father's escape from a couple of prisoner of war camps there. Explain a little bit about your point of view and how that then leads us to the Operation Loco.
Yeah, so obviously the Italian armistice, the Italian surrender, they're joining the Allied side, had been in negotiation for weeks, if not months, before the Allied landing. So we knew what was on the cards, and Dudley Clark, Colonel Dudley Clark, and Simmons, his deputy, had MI9, the escape and evasion specialists. They were responsible for that area, and they had put forward a plan, and their plan was, look, before the armistice is even announced, we'll parachute in trained, A Force and Special Forces agents and SOE agents into the camps to guide the prisoners of war out of them. So 24 hours before the armistice, they break free, go into the hills, and then we can mount proper POW rescue operations. They were completely ignored. Churchill demanded, long before the armistice, that measures would be put in place to ensure the Allied POWs were looked after, and none were sent to Nazi Germany. And Roosevelt, backed him up. So, everything should have been in place for there to be a plan to deal with this. But what happened instead was, for whatever reason, the War Office and MI9 actually issued what became known as the Stay Put Order. And the Stay Put Order was, because all the camps had hidden radio sets so they could get communications in. And it was basically, I paraphrase, but, to all the senior officers in those camps, the order was all of the prisoners will stay put. And if any try to escape, you will put your own men on the watchtowers to replace the Italian guards. And you will, you'll open fire. And anybody who tries to escape will be court-martialed. That was the insanity of the Stay Put Order. The idea being that the Allies would somehow land in Italy and just roll up the Italian and German opposition and liberate all the camps within 24 hours. Of course, it was It was rank insanity. It was massive blunder of the Second World War. And so what resulted from that was, of the 80,000 British and Allied POWs in the camps, around 30,000 did defy the stay put order and they escaped into the mountains. But 50,000 of them, around that number, were rounded up by the Germans, who took over the camps pretty much immediately and shipped north to Nazi Germany, just as Dudley Clark and Anthony Simmons had warned. Crazy.
I mean that's nearly 4 infantry divisions worth of people that could be put back into the war effort. I mean, it is bizarre to think about. But getting to the SAS themselves, the other thing is that, as with all of your books, there are many moving parts. There's ex-Foreign Legion people. There's a Pole or two. There's the OSS are involved in this. MI9, as you said there. This sort of, it comes sort of out of nowhere, this mission, but it kind of leads off this stay put order and this idea of Bill being turned down for what he wanted to do. So give us the nucleus of how this came about. And like with a lot of things, it doesn't seem to take that long to actually get put together once the idea gets mooted.
Yeah, so 2 SAS land on the heel of Italy at Taranto, the port of Taranto, serving as the tip of the spear for an Allied invasion fleet. Their mission is to take the port city and then probe and attack enemy forces inland. And it's a German parachute division, absolutely battle hardened from the Eastern Front, who have been sent into that area to stop the Allies. As you say, the 2 SAS at that time are made up of a real kind of like smorgasbord of nationalities and different forces. So just as an example, there is what was known as the French Foreign Legion Squadron serving in 2 SAS. And how did it come about? It came about because Bill Sterling, with great vision, said to this chap called Raymond Perrault, who was a former French Foreign Legionnaire who'd basically escaped from France, served with the SOE as an assassin for a while, then got unmasked by the enemy, and then volunteered for the SAS and became one of Bill Sterling's first recruits. And Sterling had said to him, look, this is in North Africa. The foreign legionnaires were sat around with nothing to do under Vichy French rule. And Bill Sterling said, go and recruit as many legionnaires as you can, because they will be invaluable as SAS operators. So loads of legionnaires deserted the Legion, joined 2 SAS, and so they're part of this force that lands at Taranto. They're fighting their way in, and they're doing a very good job. And then, 48 hours into the operation, they've kind of consolidated their base at Chiatona railway station, just to the west of Taranto. And out of the blue, out of no man's land, riding in a purloined Italian police car, comes this guy called Zelko, and he's like, I'm an escaped Yugoslav partisan, and where have you escaped from? I've escaped from Pistissi concentration camp. And of course, the first question is, well, what's a concentration camp? Because we just didn't know at that time, or certainly, yes, those in power had a very good idea, but the men on the ground would have no idea whatsoever. So, Zelko explains in great detail that the Italian concentration camps were not a great deal better than those in Nazi Germany. And Pistissi was full of Yugoslav partisans, French resistance fighters, Greek resistance fighters, Polish resistance fighters, former French Foreign Legionnaires, Jews, and any Italian with the temerity to stand against Mussolini's role. And so, the question then obviously arose, well, why have you come here to tell us? And this is the point. He said, well, because you have landed, they're about to round everybody up from the camp and ship them north to Nazi Germany in trains. And if they do manage to do that, it's a death sentence. So basically, his plea was for a mission to intervene, which would obviously be, for humanitarian reasons. Pistissi was deliberately placed in, as you can see from that map, in a very remote part of Italy where, it had been kind of like malaria-ridden swamps before they'd cleared the land and built it. So there was no strategic or military reason to seize it. So if anyone was going to intervene and do as Zelko had asked, it would have to be for humanitarian means.
And this then sets itself up for being, if there's such a thing as a perfect mission for two SAS. This is it. I mean, Italy is all about, on a grander scheme, it's all about logistics. It's all about getting enough artillery there and enough shipping and all that kind of stuff there. And that's how the Allies are going to push their way gradually up the whole of the country. But this is not that. This is now kind of fast, get moving, initiative, improvisation, living off the land, living off captured stuff, and just kind of making it up as you go along. And I don't say that in a disrespectful way, but I say this is not like a regimented, this is the first element. This is just, come on, lads, let's go and do this. But I mean, sort of.
100%. I mean, this is thinking the unthinkable and then doing the unthinkable. We've got hundreds of concentration camp victims which need rescuing. They're around about 120 kilometers behind enemy lines, from Taranto to Pistici. None of them, very few of them, can be capable of moving under their own steam. We need transport. We've got a handful of Willis jeeps which seat 4 people. How are we going to do it? Well, in SAS training, we taught to blow up trains, obviously, but how about hijacking one and just driving it to Pistici and liberating the camp? And because they're expecting a train to turn up anyway, that is the plan they put together. It's like, it seems remarkable, almost unbelievable, but it's exactly what they decided to do. The one problem was, obviously they had to purloin a train, but that wasn't too difficult. The one problem was they needed someone to drive it. And I didn't realize until I started researching the book, but operating a steam train is really, really difficult to do. It's a real art. You don't just switch the key and turn on the engine. You've got to fuel those boilers, get it up to steam. You've got to know what you're doing. And cast around, no one in the SAS present on the ground had driven a train. So, they drew a blank, and eventually they turned to the 21 Field Park Company, a airborne Royal Engineering unit that was there, embedded within the Taranto forces. And Major Oswald Carey Elwes, the commander on the ground, because Bill Sterling was not allowed to deploy, drove over in his Jeep and basically explained to Major Henniker, the guy in charge of the engineers, he said, look, any train drivers around, and, gave him a one-liner on the basics of the mission, and openly calling it that we need a driver for our pirate train. And Henniker got his sergeant major to call out, instructions, anyone who can drive a train, take several steps forwards, and 2 guys did, and one of them, Sapper Elkin, was volunteered, and he happened to be, before the war, a train driver on the Cornish Riviera Express, which goes from Penzance to London. It's the Penzance to London line. And so he's volunteered, jumps in the Jeep and drives off the Carryalls, and, that they're all set to go. It's, to us, it seems almost inconceivable that this might even be thought of, but to them, it was the only and obvious thing to do. And then you've got to think about it as well. You've got that rail route to follow, but there's a major set of points at a junction at Metaponto. So unless you capture Metaponto junction and set the points the right way, you can't even guarantee the train's going to get there and get back again. So the second plank of the plan is, well, we'll send a jeep-borne mission, which Carryalls commanded, behind the lines overland, and they'll take the junction and hold the junction for long enough for the train to steam there and steam back again. So that's the mission they put together.
And remarkably, they're not even going to have easy communications. I mean, communications is always an issue in World War II because, if you're lightly equipped, radios, this is Arnhem all over again, isn't it? Signals don't carry. So you've got to coordinate something like this. You're going deep behind enemy lines, and you've somehow got to arrange, because with the train, there's only one way you can go. I mean, there's the enemy could work out where you're going. If you're moving through the mountains on foot, as the SA, or through the desert, as the SAS had done previously, a bit different. But trains, kind of, there's schedules, there's things you go past. You go past control towers and boxes and points and stations and platforms and railway staff. And I mean, and people might be thinking this all, it takes a few hours, but it ends up, and I'm sort of skipping ahead a bit, some of these men end up spending like this months. They're involved in these, as I said in the introduction, these kind of side missions. This sets something going that kind of becomes its own campaign in a way.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this mission, which became nicknamed Operation Loco, it became like a calling card to SAS in Italy. And once Churchill realizes that the state order has been issued, because he wasn't even informed, He's obviously apoplectic, and he demands that everything is done to at least try and get those 30,000 POWs who've escaped and are hiding out in the mountains back to Allied lines, especially as the Italian winter's starting to bite. And so Major Simmons and sorry, his name's gone, Dudley Clark, the first people they turn to are two SAS, because obviously they're the perfect people to drop behind the lines. They've just pulled off this amazing concentration camp rescue mission. And incidentally, amongst those they rescue are lots and lots of former partisans and resistance fighters, any number of whom, as soon as they've been rescued, volunteer on the spot to join the SAS because they just love what they've seen, and then soldier with them throughout the war, including on these future POW rescue operations.
Yeah, it sounds extraordinary, and as we've always established with your books, it is extraordinary, and that's what makes your books such fantastic reads. And there are some, there are so many characters that you always talk about, and as you say, you've already talked about finding someone to drive the train, and there's it's cast of characters that always sounds like they're from a movie. It will be a casting director's dream to kind of cast it, because you've got this eclectic group of characters. And the one that I think we need to talk about is McGregor, because he ends up being pivotal. Carrie Elwes as well, of course, but but let's talk about McGregor.
Yeah, Lieutenant McGregor is this incredible figure. He's on the train raid, with his 8-man patrol, and that's one thing that Bill Sterling did actually, which was really visionary. Was in training he put together patrols that kind of naturally gelled, a bunch of characters who naturally fit together, and then tried to keep them in those kind of units through, as long as he could through the war. So McGregor's there on the ground with men. He's not just served within the SAS, but he's commanding individuals he was serving with before across North Africa in regular forces. So it's a really close-knit patrol. And after the great train raid, and Dudley Clark recruits two SAS to carry out these POW rescue missions, dropping deep behind the lines. They pull straws to see who will get the airborne side of these operations, because they're also going in by sea, of course, posing as Italian fisherfolk. And McGregor wins. He's the lucky guy who gets to go in by air, which is what they all want to do. The most extraordinary thing about the mission that follows, in terms of McGregor and his men, is that they're sent in initially for 10 days. It's supposed to be a 10-day mission, and they've got radio contact with headquarters. Okay, so they drop in. Of course, the radio's completely malfunctions. So there's no contact with headquarters. No way to call in, arms, ammunition, food, cold weather gear, money, anything. So they're on their own. And some of them, McGregor included, continue to carry on with their mission for months on end. One of them doesn't come out until 6 months after they've inserted behind the lines. And for all that time, the only way they are able to survive, because there's no contact with headquarters, is to rob and steal and beg and borrow off the enemy, basically. So they are a band of Robin Hood warriors, and it's exactly what they do. And the more incensed and enraged the German enemy, become at their operations, because they are increasingly successful and blatant in what they're doing, not just rounding up POWs, and getting them across the lines, but also, of course, attacking the enemy. The more they send in SS hunter squads to hunt McGregor down, the more he says, great, it's more targets for us. I'll give you an example of how, again, it's going to sound unbelievable, but it's absolutely true. At one stage, McGregor thinks, what we really need? We need some mobility. We need a vehicle so we can do proper hit and run operations like they did in North Africa with the Jeeps. So he's found out, there's a rumor that the King of Italy has a couple of cars hidden in a barn, right? Finds out where it is, goes there, and the King of Italy's chauffeur says, yes, I've got the cars, and shows them to them. He says, right, we'll have that one. And obviously the chauffeur's having a heart attack on the spot. He says, you can't, they're the King of Italy's cars, and I've vowed to keep them safe until the end of the war. So he gets out of his pocket a piece of paper, scribbles on it, I, Brigadier McGregor, hereby agree on behalf of the King of England that I am, taking this vehicle and it will be returned in good order, or you'll be compensated fully, signed, Brigadier McGregor. Hands over the piece of paper, says, there you are, you're perfectly safe, nothing bad's going to happen, and takes the vehicle. And that becomes their battle wagon. That's what it's the King of Italy's car that they then use to zoom around the mountains, hitting the enemy, and more importantly, hitting key, wealthy, very nasty Italian fascists in the area to basically rob and steal from them clothing, food, and money to fund these POW rescue operations. Really, just extraordinary.
I mean, it's crazy that the more the Germans send teams out to try and stop this, they just see it as you say, like having supplies delivered straight to you. You eliminate the Germans who bring them, and then you use the supplies they had, and you keep on going. I mean, and I'm going to go back to something you said about keeping it to these sort of 8-man little teams, because I think it seems that 2 SAS is the best of both worlds in a sense. It's transitioning to the fully regimental system that will be there in 44, 45, but it's taken the best of the nucleus of what had been happening earlier, of these little small teams of people who know each other very well and depend on each other. That became kind of the special forces sort of Vietnam type thing, the A team type thing. That's Bill Sterling, but also it's filtering down through people like Harry Elwes and others in this. It's this where they're a hybrid. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, it's taking the lessons from 18 months of 1 SAS waging war across North Africa and how they succeeded and did it well, but also Bill Sterling brings that kind of that vision with him. And you're absolutely right. This is really the best, as good as it gets. Yeah. Because then you've got to bear in mind, after Italy, SAS are recalled to the UK in massive expansion from, just a few hundred strong to over 2,000, 4 regiments, 2 French regiments, a Belgian squadron, 2 British regiments. And, that massive expansion, that dilutes that kind of brand of brothers, small, close to control sense of how you wage war. So this is really where that reaches its apex, and you can see in some of the kind of these POW rescue operations that take place, and the banks they rob, and just the sheer brilliant skullduggery and piracy that they're involved in. They are freewheeling, self-sustaining, raiding special forces bands. They sustain themselves. McGregor, at the end of his deployment, so when he comes back across the lines, and of course he and all of his men have been given up for dead long ago. Of course, they're just like ghosts returning from the netherworld. And when he returns, he manages to bring back, or they manage to bring back, all but one of the patrol alive, and even that member of the patrol who's missing is in a German POW camp. So, unbelievably successful.
And I think I want you to confirm to us that despite the fact that you're banding about phrases like renegades and Robin Hood, I think there is still a lot of military discipline. This isn't a rabble. This isn't, we're kind of mentioning recent screen versions of things where there's a suggestion that everything is just, a rowdy gang of hoodlums. There's an element of improvisation. Now, clearly, they are personalities, they are characters, but it's still a military unit with discipline, with orders, with structure, isn't it? I mean, I think you'd be clear you want to get across this, that they are kind of doing their own devices, but it has structure.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, discipline is actually the most important aspect, you could argue. Look, when guys were recruited into the SAS and went through selection, they realized very quickly it was just a different kind of discipline. It wasn't parade ground yelling and paperwork and the brig. It was either you behave yourself within the parameters that we set, and you become self-empowered, or you will be returned to your unit. It was self-discipline, and only with that self-discipline could you carry out the kind of things that McGregor and his men do behind the lines for 6 months and get away with it and survive. Self-discipline and brotherhood were absolutely to the fore. So although the means were, that they were on the edge of, you could argue, what was legal at the time, very much so. They were adhering to their mission. At no stage were they involved in any of this activity, but to further their mission. So when they, attacked a local Italian fascist who was involved in rounding up the Allied POWs to secure the bounty the Germans had put on all their heads, and including bounty, of course, massive bounty put on McGregor and his men. But when they attacked these guys and they robbed them blind, they didn't do that for their own benefit. They did it so they could go to the POW and say, right, here's some shoes, here's some clothing, here's some food, here's some money, and there's the escape line, here's your first guide, off you go.
I mean, sorry.
Even right at the end, George Arnold is the last man to come out from McGregor's patrol, and he's been captured by the enemy and unmasked pretty much, and still managed to escape. And even on that, during those last days, as he and a chap called Nikolic, who was an OSS, American special service operator, because they had Americans embedded in all the patrols. Yeah. Even as they are themselves escaping, and by now they've been unmasked and they're hunted, they still bring a last batch of escaped POWs back with them. So they're true to the mission right to the end.
Yeah, and I think that's important to that it's not like they're trying to. I'm thinking of Patton's ridiculous Task Force Baum in Northwest Europe a year and a half later, where he tries to go and rescue people, doesn't even have the means of transporting. This isn't that. This is basically giving these POWs the opportunity to then put their destiny into their own hands. The SAS basically facilitate with weapons, with supplies and information. Don't go that way, go this way. You can go that way. Which is why every time you're on, we always try and measure the success of special forces missions, because they all have curious levels of, balancing propaganda, national pride, starting a concept that will be developed later on. But this one absolutely reaps dividends, as you say, it in some ways in a negative way, because again, more attention goes on the SAS. So when they get to the France and Germany later, they have certain restrictions on them, and as you say, the expansion, which was like a double-edged sword. It was a good thing. It was a reward for being good, but it was also, as you say, the death knell of the original small group of people. But we need to talk about the prince who was in the camp there, because I mean that's just an extraordinary. So I was going to try and attempt to read his name, but I'm not brave enough to try and attempt it. But he's a central figure in this story.
Yeah, so there was there is a very distinguished Italian royal lineage, and I'll call him Prince Filippo because the name's very hard to pronounce.
Yes, if you can't do it, I'm glad I didn't even try.
No, and my Italian researcher did try to teach me how to do it, but I kind of like rolled over and accepted failure. So Prince Filippo was extremely wealthy from this long-lived, royal lineage, and even before the start of the war, he petitioned Mussolini to, and the Italian Prime Minister as well, to not make a pact with Nazi Germany. So he's a die-hard anti-fascist and Democrat. And when, of course, Italy joined the Axis, he then became known as the underground mayor of Rome, and he was basically a massive Italian resistance funder and supporter. And eventually he was unmasked by the Italian fascist police, the OVRA, and he was sent to Pastisi concentration camp. So he's one of those individuals who was plucked out of it by the SAS operation and brought back to enemy lines. And as soon as Allied lines, and as soon as the Allies liberated Rome, so a few months later, he was appointed Rome's first mayor. So this was a very, very important individual to the Allies. I do kind of wonder, to a certain extent, as to whether that was part of the reason they went, because for that very reason. But I've not been able to unearth any evidence that confirms that. And there's nothing that would suggest that in the Italian archives. There is a document in Italian archives which reports that they, having rescued as many people as they could from the concentration camp, they also managed to get into the kind of like, not the bank, but where they stored all the money to pay the guards, and they liberated 100,000 lira from there, and then went into what would be the guards' mess, I guess, and liberated all the alcohol. So walked away with 176 bottles of brandy and various other prizes. So once again, it's this concept that you can operate behind the lines, you can do the absolute unthinkable, and that by doing that, the enemy are not going to perceive that it's even going to be possible, and then you can find ways to survive even without a normal chain of logistics or supply.
I want to bring the Jeeps in because when we talk about one SAS back in North Africa, in many ways that the other enemy was the desert itself. It was conditions, it was weather, navigation, keeping vehicles on the road. There's the whole LRDG helping them out initially, but in Italy, it's a different set of problems because you've got a lot more of a population around you than you did in certain parts of North Africa. So we had a question from Kevin came in about, did they have any Italian partisan help? Now, you mentioned the people that were in the camps, they're going to try and help the former POWs, but on the way there, obviously they're battling the Germans, including SS columns and these sort of counterinsurgent columns, and they're taking their equipment, but they're obviously also encountering Italians of different loyalties, shall we say? Because 43 is everything's changing in Italy, isn't it? So it's not. It's a very different culture that the SAS are going into in Italy than it was in North Africa. So Italian partisans.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a great question because we mustn't forget the huge number of brave Italians who stepped forward to help the SAS and other units. So especially when they dropped into those POW rescue operations deep behind the lines, were it not for the help of the local Italians, that they would not have endured. And bear in mind, the SAS, you could argue, although of course Hitler had issued his commando order many months ago, so they were under a death sentence formally. Yeah. But you could argue, captured in uniform, bona fide operatives and bona fide nation, they may have been taken as a prisoner of war. They may have been, given the protection of the Geneva Convention. But any Italian found helping them or soldiering with them or sheltering them, not only would they get killed and all their family get killed, but their village would get wiped out and burnt to the ground. So what the local Italians risked to help McGregor and his men, for example, in these operations is beyond praiseworthy. And we mustn't forget that by now, any number of Italians were sick to death with fascism and the war. All they really wanted was to go back to peace and doing what Italians do well, which is having a good quality of life. And, in that spirit, they stepped up to the plate time and time and time again.
And with the Jeeps, I just mentioned the fact in North Africa, it's navigation, it's, that kind of stuff. Because it sounds bonkers that you'd be able to do anything, behind the lines with such obviously, armed to the teeth vehicles there. I mean, the train is one issue. We can come back to training again in a minute, but were there any specific problems on this mission and the ones that followed it about using Jeeps and things like that in that particular terrain and climate and conditions?
Yeah, I mean, Jeeps are very distinctive, especially SS Jeeps. You can see, with all their bolted on weaponry. That was the key problem. You had eyes everywhere in Italy, which you didn't have in North Africa.
Yeah, exactly.
The desert was the perfect place for waging hit and run Jeep warfare because you could just emerge from the empty desert wastes, attack your target,
and then disappear again. Yeah,
and disappear again. It was perfect. Whereas Italy was very, very different. So, apart from the mission by Carrie Elwes to secure the road and rail junction at Metaponto, there are not many Jeep-borne operations that feature in the book. There's Roy Farron, the SS captain, carries out several Jeeping operations, but they're damn high risk, and he's completely aware of that. There's no way that they can often find a way through. It's just impossible. They're too characteristic and too visible. And so, the kind of transport that they start to use more is commandeered local vehicles.
Yeah.
I mentioned the King's car, but there's school buses and everything in between that they kind of utilize. Bicycles, but also local fishing vessels, wooden hulled fishing vessels, which they can sail up the coast, and basically disguised as Italian fishermen. And all of that is about what the train itself espoused, which is hiding in plain sight. If you think about it, Paul, right? You're a German soldier sat in in an observation post or in a trench, guarding an area of terrain, and you see a train steaming through, right? And this is your own territory. This is you're not for one moment going to imagine it's got anything aboard it unless you can see something which isn't Italians or Germans.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So when they put Raymond Carroll, the brilliant but crazy French Foreign Legionnaire in the French Foreign Legion squadron of the SAS, and McGregor and his men aboard that train, some really, really seriously battle hardened operatives. The mission was you hiding in plain sight. You're not sat on the roof, bristling with weaponry. Yeah, you're heavily armed and, you're there to defend the train if necessary, but only if you have to be seen. Because the idea is we are steaming a train through enemy territory, which the enemy is going to believe by default is one of their own. And it's the same with all the rest of the kind of transport that they then co-opt mostly throughout the book. It's that idea of trying to hide in plain sight and get away with it.
Mm. And, we must remind ourselves, this is happening concurrently with air raids, and the Allied air forces are doing what they are with strategic bombing. There's all the things that are going to be happening on the coast later on. So it's going back in a weird way to Churchill's original 1940 rallying cry of just harass, do stuff. That when you're fearing for your life from the we've talked on the channel before about some of the terrible bombings that Italy faced maybe a bit later in the war. But as you say, that if a train goes along a track and it blows its horn and it goes past, you're just going to assume it's a regular train doing its regular thing. Although I guess in a wartime environment, there isn't necessarily much regular train, because there's always troop transports that are going through that you don't know about, that the Germans would be using themselves. So I guess you just would assume, as you say, well, it must be supposed to be there. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't supposed to be there.
Yeah,
I'm going to get on my job. But when you're talking about the individual cars and boats and things like that, coordinating this once it's a few days and weeks in must have been, it wasn't, I'm going to say impossible. It wasn't impossible because they obviously achieved it. But what were some of the challenges of just trying to keep a track of all this?
Huge. Just gargantuan. Anthony Simmons, the A Force officer who was put in charge of these POW rescue operations, which happened after the train raid, the challenges were just legion. Just to give you an example, the seaborne rescue operations, the plan is that McGregor will parachute into the mountains and others, round up the POWs. They'll be guided to the coastline, which isn't that far away, the eastern coastline, and then the A Force rescue fleet will bring them back to Allied lines. The problem with that is, of course, actually coordinating all of that so that the boat turns up at the right beach, which isn't one staked out by the enemy, at the right time to meet the POWs without the enemy detecting them. And time again, they are stymied at that last moment, at that last instant. Some of the seaborne operations are successful, but many are not. And so, McGregor, for example, pioneers the idea, well, okay, if we can't get them out by sea, let's pioneer a route through the mountains on foot south, and let's get them out that way. So it's that brilliant, not make it up as you go along, but find a way or make one. It's the fact that SAS selection and training was designed to empower every individual, no matter their rank, to get the job done. And no matter what idea you might have, all of them were given, great value and consideration. It's one reason why McGregor, who's known by his men affectionately as the boss, was so revered and so loved basically by his men, was because with just about every single key decision that was made in the field, he'd sit down with the guys and say, right, What do we do? Let's have ideas for you all, and that is empowerment. That's why, going back to the discipline thing, those individuals who found their way into the SAS and other special forces in World War II, they did not want to be returned to their unit because they had found in the SAS and related units a place where their ideas mattered, where they were empowered, they were valued, and they understood, and they felt part of something, and that was really key.
The OSS, so that they are part of this, and we did shows earlier this season series about Operation Reaper in Norway in 1945. I mean, the OSS, to some extent, they're kind of the junior partners still in 1943. I mean, their use of behind the line stuff is a bit behind where the British are. In your research for this book, how did the OSS respond to being part of this or alongside the SAS thing? Do you think it was important in their evolution as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, they I think this is their first combat deployment, operational combat deployment, certainly is of their operation groups. And, you know, the idea is inspired. So their operation group they set up for Italy is made up of Italian Americans. Obviously, what a smart thing to do. So most of these guys were, if not native Italian speakers, very good at Italian. And, you know, they hailed from families spread the length and breadth of Italy. So the idea was that at least one OSS individual would be embedded with every SAS patrol. So they had a native Italian speaker or equivalent, and someone who would act as a brilliant local guide, etc., etc. But the OSS took it one step further. So under Lieutenant Lauro, they deployed a whole OSS patrol on its own POW rescue remit, and they actually stayed in doing similar things to McGregor and his men for an equally long period of time, for months and months and months and months. And under the OSS remit, that's what they were there to do. They were there to remain in place for as long as it took, and they would only be brought back, well, not brought back to Allied lines. They would only be reunited with Allied forces when the Allied front overtook their area of operations. So that was that incredibly steep learning curve that those OSS operators were on. And you can, when you read the after action reports and interviews with the operators, which are in the American archives, and they're very good and very detailed, they learn so much from those operations in terms of what they then go on to do in other theaters of the war.
And it's interesting because I think we think of the Italian campaign as in some ways raising more conflicts between the various Allied nations. You know, Monte Cassino springs to mind, and New Zealand and France and America and Britain and that. And yet, weirdly, or not, maybe not weirdly, with what your work, which is in the smaller special forces, there's actually great harmony. You know, you've talked about the Italian partisan involvement. You've talked about the fact there's French Foreign Legion guys as part of this. Now the OSS and the Italian Americans there. Then they end up freeing people from Yugoslavian partisans as well there. It's actually sending a good message of cooperation. These guys are very good at their jobs in terms of the specialist type of warfare they do, but they're also good in many ways ambassadors for their countries, and the whole notion that if the Allies are going to win the war, it's by getting on with each other. And at this point in the war, this is exactly when the Axis are splitting up. Everything is the relationships between the protagonist nations on the Axis side are getting worse and worse, and yet here you have this really strong bond between people from all different backgrounds, different aspirations, different methodology, but they're working together and getting the job done.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you know, it was an international kind of, you know, legion from the very get-go in terms of 2SAS, because Bill Sterling deliberately went out and got, you know, Carraud to recruit all the French Foreign Legionnaires. And as you know, with the Legion, you know, the only nationality you're not allowed to be in the Legion officially is French.
Yep.
Although obviously there was the loophole, which is any Frenchman who wanted to join just went and got a Belgian passport, as did Carraud, and that's how they got in. But basically, the Legion is full of all nationalities. You can, you know, Americans, Brits, Poles, you know, Norwegians, whoever. A lot of them have joined the Legion, of course, because they know what's coming in terms of Nazi Germany. Yeah. So you have these individuals, many of whom's country has been occupied by the Nazis and still is, right? So they've got a huge reason to fight, to hunger, to strike back and liberate their homelands, and they're from, all different nationalities. The lingua franca of the Legion was French, because they needed a language in which they could communicate amongst each other, because there were so many different tongues spoken. And Major Carrie Elwes, who was the commander of the train raid and Bill Sterling's deputy at the time, he was a fluent French speaker because his father was a champagne merchant. So he's the perfect kind of liaison and go between the French Foreign Legion guys who all spoke French, or they had to, and the rest of 2 SAS. So it was a very uniquely and magically international outfit, which kind of set a precedent, I think, for Allied cooperation throughout the war. It may not have lasted of course it didn't last for all of the war, because you had Russians there as well. And of course, towards the end of the war, that started to fall apart. But for long enough, that coalition held together.
My brother-in-law, literally in the other room, we were having a dinner party later, and when he was in the Legion in the 80s and 90s, although he's a Frenchman from Normandy, he was in as a Swiss. That was his way in the Foreign Legion. So that it's still today. So as we begin to kind of wind down the conversation, you talked about this as being arguably not only the most audacious operation the SAS achieved in World War II, but it also becomes their calling card for what happened later on in Italy. You talked about the wonderful bonus of reuniting family members of people who served this. But my Damien Lewis shelf is now, I think you've just now taken over half a shelf now. This new book has just topped you over to half a shelf now. You're giving giving us these impressive stories of daring do and valor and heroism and initiative. But do you think that there's a wider role of your work to sit in the understanding of the war more generally? Because people might think, oh well, he doesn't do operational history. You're not talking about 5th Corps doing this or 7th Corps doing that. But I think that you are helping us on a wider level, because your stories are rooted in the bigger picture. And I think you always do, have a bit of a contextual understanding of the bigger picture. So I would hope you would think you are contributing to the wider understanding beyond just that of the SAS.
Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, war is about people at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Okay, it's about people and characters, but certainly in the elite forces world, the characters are larger than life, and they are, in this book in particular, they are absolutely magical characters. But what I hope people take away from a book like this is the incredible alchemy that we, basically the British, put together in the Second World War in terms of our elite forces, and those tactics, techniques, and procedures that we put together in the Second World War, working with all these different nationalities, as we discussed, set the imprimatur for what has become Special Forces operations today. You look at Operation Spiderweb in the Ukraine-Russian war, okay, where they sent those truckloads of drones thousands of kilometers in certain cases deep behind the lines to attack the Russian air bases. Well, it's so reminiscent of what Sterling were doing in North Africa in terms of those 1,000-kilometer jeep raids across the desert. The only real difference is who executes the attack on the airfield at the end. In 2 SAS and 1 SAS time, it was human beings with Lewis bombs, largely, or raiding. In the present day, in Operation Spiderweb, for example, it's drones, but the kind of same tactics, techniques and procedures, but also ethos is there. And that ethos is really, really, really important. That's what I try and drill down into each of these books. It's to try and encapsulate what that ethos was in World War II and what it still is today. And I think, that heritage is really, really important to understand. Really,
I think, and we've talked about it before. the family tree of special forces is really complicated in World War II. Units change name, they change back to the name they started with. I mean, the SAS, as we know, was a cover name that then becomes a real thing later on, etc., etc. Commandos become paratroopers, paratroopers become commandos, etc., etc., etc. Then you add the foreign elements to that as well. And yet you're right, the ethos is an easier straight line through all of that. It is a bit complicated, kind of juggling all the. So they are the small scale raiding force that become this, but the principle and it kind of all goes back to Churchill, and then people like the two Sterling brothers then taking it to another level. And as you've talked about today, people like McGregor and others then expanding on this, and Maine, of course, who we've talked about before, and then, as you say, the spreading of this like a disease, but a good disease, across the other nations, who all then go back and then begin their own units, but all kind of on the same family tree.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's the key message. And, you know, bear in mind, at the end of the war, what is it about we Brits? You know, we're great at inventing stuff, and then we're great at, like, you know, doing away with it. So at the end of the war, you know, October 45, you know, powers that be, Churchill's voted out of power. You know, they decide that they'll disband the SAS, and they do. And they also get rid of the SOE, of course. The French, by contrast, you know, they take their SAS regiments back to France, and they keep the identity and the spirit alive in France. Yeah. With active units, basically, after the war, and then, of course, we refound the SAS in kind of the early 50s for the Malayan emergency. But yeah, we're very. I still think we are today. We're very bad at shouting our successes from the rooftops. And, you know, the founding special forces soldiering in World War II by Britain is something that we should be really, really proud of, and we should, you know, keep telling these stories and keep being vocal about it. You know, we need our elite forces even more today than we ever have done, in my view. And we need the morale to be absolutely at its apex, because, you know, messages I get from people who are, you know, recently served, who are still serving, is that morale is not very good at the moment, for reasons which I would imagine are self-evident. And so we need to keep getting these stories out there. We need to keep repeating this message. We really do, because, you know, what happened when the Americans wanted to found Delta Force? Lieutenant Colonel Bucky Burris, who, you know, good friend, you know, and one other, they get on a plane, fly to the UK, put themselves through British SAS selection to learn how to do it. And this is something we just need to be really, really proud of.
I had some frankly idiots commented on the show we did about Churchill and de Gaulle yesterday with fantastic Richard Vinan, and then the comment afterwards is that, because his book is called The Last Titans, how Churchill and de Gaulle transformed the world, and he said they didn't transform the world. Everything that transformed the world in World War II was done by FDR in the USA. And I'm thinking, well, that is just a patently ridiculous comment, isn't it? I mean, we're not saying that the FDR didn't change the world, and absolutely the US comes out of World War II a much, much bigger player. But we can't, it's not about the size of a contribution to the war. Is not about necessarily the number of divisions on the ground or the number of material tons. It's about ideas and principles. And I think that's as you said there and articulated very, very, very well, the principles of what the SAS stood for are universal and timeless. And their contribution is, I mean, they absolutely outpunched. They punched above their weight. When you take in the airfields in North Africa and Italy and the ETO and Greece and everywhere else, they absolutely punch above their weight. But even if they didn't punch above their weight, they still, as you made it very clear, established a way of doing things and a methodology and a courage, and et cetera, et cetera. And so for that reason alone, the work you do in profiling what these incredible men did is very important. So obviously we've talked about your hopes for the book and what have you. You're still out there on the circuit. You've got more, and you're going on tour. You're doing a proper, like, a stadium tour next year, right? So tell us a little bit about that, because that's incredible that you're going out and you're telling these stories in theaters, aren't you, in the UK?
Yeah. It's something that I've wanted to do for a long time, is just talk about really the history of, you know, the founding of UK special forces from World War II pretty much through to the present. So it's a 2-hour show. There are some audio visuals with it. It's nationwide. You can find details on my website or Facebook or Twitter. And it's in spring of next year. It's all across the UK. And I'll be telling lots of really fascinating, incredible stories. And I'm really looking forward to doing so. But, once again, I'm going back to what I was saying. It's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog. Yeah. And that's what these stories epitomize. You are 100% accurate in terms of what the SAS, the Commandos, and other units, SOE, contributed during the war. So underappreciated. They were what we now understand as a force multiplier. A force multiplier is a small body of men or women you drop into the field to basically, multiply the effect of that force on the ground. That's exactly what they were. And just the opening scenes of SAS, the Great Train Raid, it opens with just less than 24 men, Sterling's raiders, drop deep behind the lines, blowing the smithereens out of a load of German trains, speeding to the front to rebuff the Allied landings. That in itself, just that alone, blocking those tunnels for days on end, blowing up armored trains, that in itself is invaluable. And then you look at the rest of the achievements throughout, the missions that chronicled in the book. It's hard to put into words the risks these people undertook and the benefits that they brought back to Allied forces, and the courage. Seriously, the courage. You look at some of these operations, especially when McGregor and his men and Kuraud and his men just spend months behind the lines, kind of out of contact with no supply lines, waging the most incredible warfare and operations, and the courage involved in that cat and mouse game they were playing. No one had ordered them to spend 6 months behind the lines. They were there for 10 days. The courage involved it's humbling.
And the mental strain. I mean, you and I have talked on this channel before about PTS and what have you. I mean, I would defy any of these guys to come back, no matter how proud they were of their achievements, to not be, to some extent, broken by all this. I mean, Colonel Mayne is probably the clearest example of someone. The war damaged him beyond anyone's sort of perception there. But I mean, all of these people came back deeply scarred by these things, despite their heroism. And amazing stuff.
And the other thing about just to mention, most of them never spoke about it, and that's because you don't speak about trauma. Because if you speak about trauma, suddenly you've unmasked it, and it's you fall apart. I speak to so many families of veterans from World War II and more recently, and they say, Granddad never spoke about the war, or they say, I only got Granddad to open up once and tell a story from the war, and he just broke down in tears, and I vowed never to do so again. So they carried the trauma with them after the war for most of them for the rest of their lives. And just to give you an example of what this means in reality, I met Kate Carey Elwis, who's Major Oswald Carey Elwis's daughter, several years back, and I went up to her house in Oxford, partly to help kind of look through the family archive and try and work out what her father had done in the war, because he never breathed a word, never said a single thing about it. Just used to say to her whenever she asked, "Oh, that's not the kind of thing, darling, that a proper English girl should want to talk about." And so, 2 or 3 years after having met Kate, I was actually going through Paddy Mayne's war chest and a load of the documentation, and they came across this. The first time I came across a report on the Great Train Raid, and I thought, this cannot be true. And then, lo and behold, the man who's commanding it is Oswald Carey Elwis. I'm like, oh, it's Kate's father. So then I called her up and said, words to the effect, Kate, you sat down. I mean, and because I said, look, I want to tell you something your father did during the war. And I told her about his role commanding that mission. And can you imagine what that was like? And at the end of the conversation, she just made this really kind of like moving comment. And she said, the one thing my father did tell me was that in the SAS, they were taught to drive trains. And they were after Italy, in the preparation for the D-Day landings. That's one thing SAS were then taught to do, was to not
Just add it to the list, just in case.
driving
Just in
trains.
case.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, we get with the question about the fact, this will be the last question I ask you, is were there decorations? And one of the things that you look at is that because they're in an unconventional situation, there are these sort of caveats about can't specifically say what it was you were doing and no publicity. That's sort of particularly to the SAS in this, is that it was like hush decorations. I kind of got it right, haven't I?
Yeah, well, for the train operation, no SAS person was put forward for a decoration. The only person who was put forward for a decoration was Sapper Elkin. Remember the guy was volunteered to drive the train. He was put forward for a military cross, and even that was denied. And the whole thing was just completely silenced. And then, for example, with McGregor's operations, for 6 months further on in the war, liberating POWs, there was some fitting decorations were given out, but the citations, really interestingly, some of them are partially redacted.
Yep.
And then nearly all of them are marked, words to the effect, not for publication, never to be released to the public. So there was, there was obviously a degree of sensitivity to these operations, which was recognized even at the time. The only kind of publicity that was given to a lot of these missions from Italy was much later in the day, and it kind of went against what Churchill really hoped for with a lot of the Commando and Special Forces operations. With his immense kind of clear-sighted vision, he realized that what the British people needed in particular early on in the war was belief that we could fight, could hit back. And Commando raids and then Special Forces operations gave us that belief. They may have been pinpricks, you could argue, in the wider scheme of the war, but they made great newspaper headlines, and they traveled well across the Atlantic, which means the Americans read them and concluded there's still fight in the British Bulldog, and that was really key.
Well, we'll leave it there, and I can offer no greater praise than when I'm going away on holiday down to the south of France tomorrow, and I haven't read your book. I rarely don't go into a show without having done my prep, but I wanted to save it. I wanted to save it to read while I'm looking over them of Marseille. So everything I've done is from the notes that your fantastic agent Sophie sent me. So apologies if I've given you the illusion, viewers, I have read the book. I haven't read the book, but I'm going to start it tomorrow on my flight down south. So there you are. I get a lot of books sent to me, but I've chosen to read yours on Hollybobs. So there we are. So Damien, it's been fantastic talking to you. Good luck with the tour next year. We cannot wait for the next exciting story to drop because you set the benchmark so high every time. But I have every faith in you that you'll pluck another one out and amaze us again. So folks, you know what to do. The links to Damien's website and the tour is in the description below. The links to the bookshop are in the description below, or find it wherever you get your books. Quite a few of us said you've just ordered it while he was talking there, so that's fantastic. I will see you all after my vacation. Cheers, Damien. Cheers, everybody. Thanks. Bye.
Cheers.